Eric here from Chromium Space Sound Gallery. Wanted to share a few tips on restoring plastics after I got a lot of questions about our recent cube restoration that we posted on Instagram. We'll bring you through the steps with some detail on how we got the shine on the table. The as found table is in the back, the restored one is in the front. You have to closely evaluate the piece to determine what steps you're going to take. You're going to need various grits of sandpaper all the way from 220 to 400 to 600, 1000, 1500, 2000, and 2500. You may not need them all, but you'll probably need most of them. You'll also need my go-to potion, Mother's Mag and aluminum polish, which is actually used for cleaning wheels on automobiles. I also like to use Flitz polish for a final polish on the plastics. You'll need plenty of soft cloths and clean water. The first step is to thoroughly clean the piece with soap and water and a wet rag. You want to remove all of the surface dirt and grit which could potentially cause scratches in the piece. If there are deep surface scratches in the piece, you'll want to start with a 220 grit. Otherwise, you can go right to a 400 to begin with. All of the sanding is going to be done with wet sandpaper. You want to do this because you want to eliminate or reduce any heat buildup. The heat buildup can actually cause blemishes in the plastic surface that will then be later almost impossible to take out once you get to the polishing stage. So remember, sand everything wet. People always ask me, how long should I sand the plastic for? You're using the water to keep the plastic cool, and you can keep sanding it until you get this kind of milky residue. Make sure that you're sanding evenly and that you've reached particularly the corners and the edges. And once you've covered the surface and this milky residue appears, then you're finished with the 400 grit. After each sanding, you're going to use a clean wet rag to remove the residue that's on the piece, making sure that you've cleaned it thoroughly. Super important, after the piece is cleaned, change the water, clean the rag, and make sure that there's no residual grit. Unfortunately, there are no shortcuts here. You're going to have to go through the same steps for each of the progressively finer grits. Each time wet sanding, cleaning the piece, making sure that you've removed all the residual, and then move to the next finer grit. At the 2000 grit, you will see that the piece is already smooth. By the time you get to the 2500 grit, the water should start beading on the surface. This indicates that you've done all the steps properly. Again, clean the surface of all the residual before you begin the next step. I've tried many different polishes, but this remains to be the one that I like the most. A lot of folks ask me how much Mother's I need to put on the piece, and I kind of liken it to shoe polish. You want to put on a thin, consistent layer. You don't want to see streaks of white, but a thin, consistent layer over the entire piece. Now it has to be thick enough that you're creating lubricity for the polisher, but not thick enough that it's going to soak the polishing wheel. So you're putting on a relatively thin layer across the entire piece very evenly. The idea here is to keep the buffing wheel moving. Don't let it sit in any one position for a very long period of time, as you'll actually cause a divot and a melting in the plastic, which is a blemish that is very hard to remove. So you keep the wheel moving, you're removing some of the Mother's polish, make sure you get the corners and the edges and try to get each surface evenly. I like to do 2 applications of the Mother's polish, buffing both of them. I very much like to use Flitz polish for a final kind of polishing on the piece. Now, I don't use Flitz polish for the mechanical buffing or the buffing wheel because I find that it doesn't have the lubricity that the Mother's has. So in this case, I'm using Flitz polish to do kind of a hand buffing. Again, you put the polish on the piece, you move it around and make sure that it's a very even layer, and then using clean parts of the cloth, dry cloth by the way, clean parts of the dry cloth, you slowly buff the flitz polish until the entire surface is glossy. This, I find, puts on a very nice finish shine, and I think you'll be very pleased with the result. You have the option to do this for more than one layer. It doesn't matter too much. I usually find that by this point in the polishing cycle, all you need is one application of the flitz polish. Sometimes when I'm ready to ship the piece out, I'll do a second application just to make sure that there are no smudges or blemishes before the piece goes out to the customer. But at this point, I think you'll be pretty happy with the results and the gloss that you get in the resulting piece. You can see some of the gloss here in the light of the workshop. Again, the piece is looking pretty shiny. We'll continue to polish it a little bit to remove some of that residue, but overall the piece is looking in really great shape. Hope you enjoyed this, and thanks for watching from Eric at the Chromium Space Sound Gallery.